Communication is about transferring information from your brain to someone else's through whatever means possible. An enlightening thing that I read in an article that you had written, and it's very true. But why do we get it so wrong?
Way to begin the conversation, Helen. I think firstly, part of communication is defining key terms up front. So I like to quote Voltaire with this. If you wish to converse with me, define your terms. And the reason Voltaire was so passionate about this, and myself as well, is that unless you have a common understanding of key concepts that really underpin your conversation, you will never have that perfect flow of information and emotion, which is what communication is all about. So part of the problem is that people perceive communication itself differently. We don't bother to align on what we even mean by communication. That is one of the foundational issues. The second thing is that, so my quote from the article began with information flow from one person's brain to someone else's. I then mentioned the other equally important dimension, which is the thing that I care the most about, and we get it so horribly wrong, which is emotion flow. We just ignore it, right? There is so much dimensionality every time we communicate. Yes, there's the information part, which is often what is spoken, what is written, like the visible words. And I like you, I love words, and I'm super obsessed. But alongside the words themselves, Helen, you've got the delivery vehicle, which a large part of that is the emotion that comes through with the words. And that will vary greatly. And that emotion is also transmitted from your brain to someone else's. Well, actually from your heart to someone else's, right? And that emotion has a massive, massive impact on the other person, to the point where the words themselves might be completely thrown out the window. So because we fail to recognize the full multidimensionality of communication, we think of it as just the high level message that's being said, right? We fail to see that there's a lot more around it. There's a whole set of signals that we just don't absorb fully or consciously. They happen, but we don't realize that they happen. We're not being scientific at all about it. And we're not taught how to communicate. We just expect that children and adults just naturally through osmosis absorb how to communicate. That's completely wrong. And again, all of this is part of why I'm so passionate about the topic. And I want people to become more scientific about communication. I want us all to be communication scientists.
Let's talk about what that is, because you are a communication.
I try to be. I'm not perfect, Helen. I think one thing I'll say up front is people think, oh, yeah, you call yourself a communication scientist. That means that every single time you communicate, you achieve your objective. Nonsense. No. I often fail. As part of being a scientist is running experiments and failing, but learning from the failure, right? So I think that just to set records straight, I often get things wrong when I communicate, but I am acutely aware, more aware than I probably should be, hyper aware of how wrong I am. And I feel all sorts of emotions from that, but that makes me care more, invest more into further experiments with communication.
So when we think of communication like a science, as you state, it's not data science, because communication science puts humanity first in the equation.
Exactly.
So when we think about what the science of communication actually looks like, you described it as communicating effectively at scale.
Yes.
Now,
yes, exactly.
I know that a lot of people listening to this, I have an audience where we have, senior leaders within organizations. And one of the things they would love to do, I know for a fact, is communicate effectively at scale. But what that means to them at scale might be different to what you mean. What does communicating effectively at scale mean?
Okay. Excellent framing, Helen. I would start by saying that communication science is the solution to this, okay? And to break it down further, what I mean by communication science, I referenced experimentations earlier and failure. Let's take a step back and be a bit higher level here. It's having a strategic and systematic thought process around communication as a whole, right? Which I think by default, all of us can improve on in society as a whole. And so what I mean by that is recognizing, first of all, that communication is about that information and emotion flow from your brain to someone else's, and that there is always some level of distortion. There's this arc of distortion between what you intend to communicate, what's in your brain, and the impact on someone else, whether it's one or many, how big the audience is. And so as a scientist, you try to use all the feedback signals possible, being aware of all the different dimensionalities of communication, to reduce that arc of distortion that inherently always happens between your brain, your intention, and the impact upon others. And there's many, many frameworks you can bring in to reduce that arc of distortion. But I think part of the first thing is to recognize that you can't assume that what you're thinking and feeling is perfectly going to be transmittable to someone else. Nonsense. That's the first step, right? But then it's like, okay, so how can I then detect to what level my audience isn't or is aligned with what I am thinking and feeling, and then further kind of iterate upon that. And so the frameworks come to mind. The one I'll just mention really quickly, there's so many of them. There's a relatively famous professor called Albert Mehrabian, I'm sure you've heard of him, like in early 19th scientifically tried to work out what led to the greatest impact of a message, as it were. And he had this high level kind of framing of words being about 7% of impact, tone 38%, and body language 55%. Now, this has been debated over and over again. It's not the most perfect breakdown per se, but I think that the framework though of words, yes, very important, but the tone and the body language being at least as important. That's the high level takeaway. And that is by using that and focusing on the tone and body language. This is one of, again, the most foundational frameworks. That is one huge way that you can go forward to reducing that arc of distortion. Second key thing is there's a lot of different frameworks out there focused on the audience and audience analysis. So putting the audience first. A true communication scientist is audience first, not speaker first. Right. And doing whatever you can to detect signals from your audience, including even what they're wearing, their holding themselves, their background image, for example, if you're doing a virtual call, that all contributes. And then once you can analyze your audience, then as a speaker, you can work out how to frame the message, the right tone, the right body language, and then that will further reduce of distortion. And so the more you do that, the more conscious you are, and the more you glean in the signal and try to work out ways to further improve, by definition, over time, you will be able to communicate more effectively at scale. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. So it's a case of testing and learning and patterns and identification. So
Exactly.
the other thing that you call yourself is the rhetoric doctor.
Yes. Yeah.
And I want to touch on this because this scientific approach to communication is something that has fascinated me about you and your work. And I guess I'd like to touch on the studies that you've done in this area to sort of look at this from an example of a scientific perspective.
Great. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. If you could just explain a little bit about the studies that you yourself have done in looking at communication in this way.
Absolutely. So this ties in part and parcel to how this Rhetoric Doctor title came about. It is a self-proclaimed title. It's a bit whimsical, but that's exactly who I am, right? A tribute to Aristotle as well, one of the people I admire greatly, because he was the father of the scientific method, as well as rhetoric. He's known for rhetoric, but scientific method as well. So hypothesis testing experiments, that was also something that he was trying to promote. But the reason I call myself a rhetoric doctor, there's kind of two reasons for that. The first is what you referenced, my research. So I do quite literally have a doctorate, a DPhil, a PhD, in the science of persuasive communication, in rhetoric, but with, again, the methodology of both science and human behavioral analysis, as it were. So that is a literal kind of interpretation of rhetoric doctor. And the second definition of this that I think is really important to mention is that we're quite far estranged from the ancient Greeks in the time of Aristotle. And so we view rhetoric with quite negative connotations these days. Semantic field, I think about semantic fields of words, right? So when you say a word like rhetoric, what are all the associated words and emotions, right? And they're all quite negative. Fear, rhetoric, Decisive rhetoric, political rhetoric. That comes to mind when you think about rhetoric. It has a really bad reputation these days, and I want to fix that. I want to bring it back to its former glory and make Aristotle proud, if that makes sense. So that's the breakdown of why I call myself a rhetoric doctor. So I want to be a doctor of the term rhetoric. And then my framework and my whole, the seed of communication science was really planted back when I was at the Oxford Internet Institute, which is one of the faculties of the University of Oxford. And I love it because it brings together every discipline, every single discipline, even art history, physics, of course, political science, linguistics, which is where my background is, computer science, but everything comes together, and the goal is to study data online at scale. And so I came in thinking, right, I have this very heels over head like obsession with how we communicate, language and social media, so digital platforms of communication. Can I try to measure the degree to which messages resonate on these new media platforms, focusing on, I only had 4 years to do this, so focusing on one platform, which is now called X, back then, of course, Twitter, I still call it that, and looking at one context only, which was the most rhetorical context I could imagine, really, from recent history, and perfect timing for the PhD as well, which is Brexit, the EU referendum. So I was looking at how the Brexit campaigns unfurled on Twitter, both Leave and Remain. I was measuring the different rhetorical techniques that were being used according to the framework I was putting together from the entire literature on rhetoric in old media, but applying it to new media. And it's brilliant because, Helen, part of the benefit and why we should all be communication scientists in this day and age is that in social media, there is a visible count of how successful your communication is. Literally, marketers do it all the time, but if you're an influencer or like you, a content creator, you can basically all the time be swimming in data about how many likes, how many shares, how many comments, how many clicks. That is all tangible information about to what level your message has worked or not. So I was using that kind of predict likes and shares of tweets based upon, again, the rhetorical content, looking at Leave versus Remain. And that took about 4 years. And it was both that scientific analysis of about 10 million tweets I gathered from the API, coupled with qualitative interviews with all sorts of campaign leaders, including the heads of Vote Leave and Stronger In, but lots of small campaigns as well, more grassroots. And showing them the data and asking them to walk me through their strategies for particular messages.
Wow.
It was all, and that came together with the data science. And so to me, that is the pinnacle of what I mean by communication science. You can literally write scripts and analyze things and run machine learning algorithms to detect things, and then run regression models, stats to work out what's meaningfully associated with success, versus the kind of the deep but still very scientific interview process, semi-structured, with various people to work out what they were trying to do, and that marries together into one piece. And to me, that's where it all began, really, communication science. And I think that if I can apply that to all aspects of my life, I don't have enough time to always measure things and run models. But the point being, if you did, yeah, that it would be the physical the manifestation of all the methods that I care about.
And if we to boil that down, now I know this is a difficult question. This is a difficult question, but if you to think of it, like to boil it down to its quintessence.
Love that word.
Quintessence of dust. Is that Shakespearean? I can't remember. To its singular point. And if you think about what successful communication by applying this scientific approach is boiled down to, what can we label that? Can we?
What successful communication can be boiled down to in essence? Okay, well, I would say, I think it's, okay, so it's the point at which the information and emotion in your head is so aligned with that of your audience that you just feel it.
Yes, I get that. I get that.
That you just feel it. There will always be some level of distortion. It's never going to be perfect. But there is a certain, you can't put it in words, ironically enough, but when you reach that level of connection with your audience, it's all consuming. It's hard to describe it, but we've all had these moments, right? With colleagues, with friends, with loved ones, family. We've all had them, but it's a feeling, Helen. I think that's what I want to communicate. It's a feeling.
And so therefore thinking about that on this sort of sliding scale, it's where the distortion between the intention of the communication and the impact of the communication is reduced. Still, like, margin of error, there's still, it's not complete, it's never going to be completely in alignment. But if we can sort of put this easy to understand process in place, rather than thinking, well, I want to be better at communication, but I don't have the time to analyze and do qualitative interviews and analyze my
exactly.
Even though you could now with ChatGPT, you could get all of your articles, your posts, and you could do some
don't get me, that is part of the reason we're in a communication crisis, Helen.
Okay,
generative AI is a whole different topic, but yeah, exactly.
But for the listeners, I'm thinking, think about this simply. Think about this in terms of that distortion. And as a scientist, taking a scientific approach to your communication, looking to continuously reduce that distortion between the intention of your communication and the impact.
Yeah.
I want to talk
A
about...
is to recognize the distortion, and then B is to iterate. Sorry. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I want to talk about something else you mentioned. It's a term by Joseph Nye. Yes, about soft power and how communication is all about soft power. We've got the brute force, hard power, but communication is that persuasion over brute force. It's that attraction over coercion. It's about winning the hearts and minds of others through the words we use and how we communicate, not just the words we use, how we are communicating ourselves. And I am wholeheartedly in agreement with that, because that's a lot of the things I teach. I coach and I train.
You're a leading expert in soft power, Helen, honestly.
Well, not sort of, I guess, fully intentionally in taking that term, but for me, my approaches with the leaders that I work with and the methodologies and frameworks and approaches I use really are about the audience first approach. It's about understanding, seeking to understand, and then responding or using strategies that really have the audience in mind. And so therefore, when we think about persuading people, influencing people, we are winning them over. We are influencing them. We are bringing them along with us. We are aligning ourselves to the mission, to the cause that we are working towards. And we're doing that in a way that means that we're all going to be part of that we want to do it, that we're motivated to do it, that we are all working on the same team, as it were.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so that obviously is something that is really important to me. What does that mean for you? Because I know it might mean exactly that, but I'd just love to get your thoughts on soft power.
Yeah, it means a lot to me as well, Helen, because as a rhetoric doctor, I am also a practitioner of soft power. Soft power translates into persuasive communication. And it's also one of the reasons I applied to be on Traitors, right? Because by definition, I view that television program as brilliant because it literally lifts soft power rhetoric onto a pedestal and forces us all to examine strategies for soft power without real world impact. It's not real, it's all fiction, but you can then scientifically look at what's happening. So I think especially in this era of new media, and by that I do mean social media versus traditional mass media, soft power is all the more important because everyone has the ability to exercise it. And it really is, well, there's algorithms in play, but to some extent, people can go from zero to something purely through the soft power that they can exhibit in their new media profiles, if that makes sense. And that's tremendously exciting and empowering. And I think up until now, we haven't had this much potential for anyone in the world to suddenly become known through, again, it's usually online, but that will then have massive impact for them offline, right? But it's all through soft power as opposed to coercion, which back in the day, I guess for most of human civilization, actually, Helen, I would say hard power was at least as important as soft power. If you think about it, going back to the Neolithic days or hunter-gatherers, it was all about defending territory, literally men fighting each other to the death over women, things like that. That's hard power. Sure, there were shamans, I'm sure, back then who were trying to use religion or certain concepts to persuade and influence in a soft power way. But and up until recently, even with world wars, hard power. So really only in the past gosh, like 80 years, as it were. We're in this unprecedented era of soft power. And that is exactly why, Helen, everyone should try to be more of a communication scientist, because rhetoric and communication matter more than they ever have, because we're in this era of soft power.
Yes.
So this is
And
all kind of comes back.
no,
Yeah.
I love it because we all do hold, therefore, so much power in terms
Exactly.
of how
Exactly.
we are influencing people. And, especially online, there's so much going on at the moment in the online world, too much to really touch into about how people are using their soft power in harmful ways and positive ways. But as a listener listening to this, who I know a lot of people who are sharing their content online that listen to this podcast, who are sharing their thought leadership and their views and their messages and their stories, that to be so conscious, to be really conscious and scientific about how you are sharing this information, what it is you're sharing, why you're sharing it, and thinking continuously about this, reducing this distortion, which I'm going to keep coming back to.
Please, thank you.
Is so important, and why communication science is not data science, because it is about putting humanity over data, even though the data is really useful to look at within that.
And data science, as I mentioned earlier with my thesis in particular, as an example, it can actually be used in communication science. It's natural language processing, which has had a massive, massive boom because of these large language models, these generative AI models. But again, different podcast topic.
Well, I mean, I would love your thoughts on that, but I mean, maybe,
No, exactly.
maybe another one.
Yeah, but data science actually fits into communication science as a methodology through which you can try to scientifically look at and analyze your messages, especially online, because again, it's all downloadable at scale. You can try to work out what is in common across the posts that you make that are getting the most shares and comments, for example, right? That kind of thing. It's all easily available to you as a creator.
Now, the reason why you're speaking to me, the beginning of the journey of the reason why we're speaking, is because I am a huge Traitors fan. And I was so excited, I think it was a New Year's Day that the first episode aired. And my children also, we love the Traitors in our house. It's a big thing. We get the popcorn, we get the drinks. We sit down and we settle in. And all three of us could not believe, we were just so upset that you were the first person to be murdered. And
I'm also upset. It brings back a lot of emotions are coming back now.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
No, good. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Because the way that you introduced yourself, the fact that you are a doctor of rhetoric, that you are a communication scientist, I would have loved to have seen how that would have played out. And of course, the reason why they did was because they felt threatened by you. Of course, we know this. But what I would love to know, and I know the listeners would love to know, is about the strategy going in to this game, which is complete fiction, and we're going to touch on that more in a minute, about when we think about communication and what you know about communication in all forms, what your strategy was.
Okay. Thank you for this question, and thank you so much for all of your support, Helen. It means a lot, and I wish I could have been on longer just to showcase some of this in action. But the strategy was premised again upon, okay, right, I'm a communication scientist. I pay attention to way more signal, like even a simple little eyebrow twitch or a "how are you" is absolutely pregnant with meaning, right? Or the absence of communication. So you expect someone to make a certain move and they don't, that signal. So with that in mind, I was thinking, right, that's my secret weapon coming into this. But the core of the strategy was to first observe, right, and try to not force it, but at least try to connect with as many people as possible, and just try to work out, based upon, again, their tone, their body language, what they're saying, how they're framing themselves, a baseline about them and how they're trying to project themselves. And then over time, you could measure further signal against that baseline. It's all about change in behavior over time. And part and parcel of that, one of the things I think I've become known for perhaps since leaving, is that I truly believed that people were overlooking one massive source of signal, which is the very outfit you're wearing. That is one of the most powerful ways in which you are communicating in the first day and henceforth. And so I had I'll just say that I think some of my hypotheses were actually quite correct from early on, based upon outfits alone. Forgetting even what people are speaking, the words came out of their mouths came secondary to how they looked and projected themselves when they first appeared. And so Leanne stands out as a case study there because she had that perfect head-to-toe manicured Barbie look, including the nails and the heels and the hot pink outfit. I thought, this feels a bit curated to me. Interesting. I wanted to keep an eye on her for that reason. And I think for good reason, she was a very strong player, right? And then Charlotte as well. Charlotte had these really cozy jumpers. I was thinking, okay, I mean, I want to trust her more because of that. But then is she do you see what I mean? And so I was picking up on these things and benchmarking people. And I think, Keith as well, very big personality. He wore this amazing jacket, like a proper kind of business jacket, and he just exuded authority. But and a lot of these first impressions came true. It's not just random chance. Yes, it's superficial, and over time you'll tell, right? But it's that immediate just absorbing that information, then trying to measure over time. Second part of the strategy was to also myself project not who I really am, something. So I'm very whimsical, so I would keep that part of it and be playful and even sing. I'll get more into that a bit later, but that was all part of the plan to hide the fact that I've done any kind of research or work in AI. And I didn't mention any of this, by the way. That wasn't what led to me, I think, being viewed as a threat. It was more just my general posture and just way of speaking, I think, not what I said. So again, that going back to Moravian's framework, right? I kind of ended up losing out from that because I wasn't paying enough attention to even how I was speaking, but to also project the sense that I could be manipulated if I were either traitor or faithful, doesn't matter. And so part of that, going back to the clothing aspect, and I have an example here, was to wear clothes that made me come across as less threatening. So I have this lovely kind of pink cardigan, which I was planning to wear early on in the castle, giant bows and hearts on the sleeves. And so the idea was, how could I be a traitor? I've literally got hearts on my sleeves. I'm wearing my emotion. I can't lie. And I say that with such sincerity and such tone, right? That with this, it just amplifies, all the signals come together and amplify each other. The way that Charlotte's Welsh accent and her cozy jumpers amplified together. Does that make sense? So that was all part of the plan, was to observe, but also project that I was absolutely a team player and could be manipulated. And the whimsy part would come in as well, because they make these little odd comments here and there that don't appear to be scientific. Yin has no logic. That didn't come out because I didn't have enough time, but that was the plan, was to make these quirky, random comments to diffuse the mood. It's a pressure cooker in there, but also just to come across as someone a bit odd and just okay, she can't add A and B together, so let's ignore Yin, kind of thing.
So is it that then that we, in order to fly under the radar, as it were, whether as a faithful or a traitor, whatever, we need to come across less intelligent?
Yeah, let me reframe that. I think there is the concept of vulnerability as well,
right,
tied to that.
Yes.
You think of confidence as strength. Oh no. In this game, as in real life as well, I'd argue, Helen, vulnerability to me is far more powerful and far more strong than confidence.
Yes.
Right. And that was, I didn't have enough time to execute that part of it as well. It isn't just wearing cozy jumpers, to be clear. I'm not trying to advocate that, leaders of organizations parade into town halls wearing cozy animal jumpers. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying, though, is that if you are too confident, and I think this is part of my downfall as well, I did try to project confusion, but it wasn't powerful enough. And I think that because I was just so energetic in the way I was self-introducing on the train, and I happened to be placed unluckily next to the lead, most influential traitor, right? That was also part of my downfall. A lot of coincidences, which is quite unfortunate. But I was very high energy in that train carriage. And that was also because I was trying to calibrate myself against everyone else in the carriage. So ironically, that was my strategy as well. It's to observe the energy level, match it, calibrate against it, be the average. But
Right.
the problem was that I was in the extroverted carriage, so everyone was more extroverted than the other two. And so there's so many factors, Helen, which don't come across in the edit, of course. And I can't really undo but the confidence and the energy came out because the sisters were they were bouncing off the train carriage. I mean, they were so high octane. I thought, okay, let me then be a bit more extroverted than I would have liked to display. And then ultimately that was probably a bit too much. So, but I was just echoing their energy, right? And so I
Yeah.
think going back to the vulnerability point, part of what I was planning to execute to kind of counteract this extroversion was maybe not cry, but just showcase to people that, I'm not a confident person and that I was insecure, worried, paranoid. Does that make sense? To kind of allow that message to come through because it makes you more relatable.
It does.
And it allows you to form a connection with your audience. And this is the bit that, again, translates outside of just Traitors, the gameplay, right? If you can't connect with someone you're working with or a leader of your organization, soft power, I don't think will work.
No.
So you need to feel like you can relate to this person, even if they're way higher up than you. It doesn't matter. We're all people, right? And if you can feel like you're on the same level as them, then the rhetoric can come out and be a million times, infinitely more impactful than it would be otherwise.
Yes, and this is where we go sort of back to the ancient sort of ethos, pathos, logos, right?
Oh, right. Yes.
Right? Because when we think of this in this sort of context, we've got, do I trust you? Which is the ethos. It's creating that trust, that sort of credibility in you as a human. And then with the pathos is, why care? It's that sort of connection. It's that emotional connection. And then with the logos, it's that sort of, do you make sense? Does it make sense in terms of the relationship? And so we kind of need all of those things for someone to, and these things do happen over time. Like, you're all thrown together in a train carriage and all of these things are being sussed out rapidly, like subconsciously almost, in sort of sussing and measuring in sort of an instinctual level. And I'd imagine, everybody's doing that themselves, but then they're also trying to consciously portray who you want to be. And that is a high stakes environment. It's a high stakes environment
Yep.
in the context of that game. And one of the initial questions I asked you when I reached out to you was communication in high stakes environments, whether that be in the workplace or in a Scottish mansion in the Highlands. It's an important thing to look at. It's an important thing to look at because we need to understand how we communicate under pressure and how all our best laid plans, when we are conscious and calm and we are looking at reducing that distortion between intention and impact, can maybe fly out the window when
100%.
we are in a high stakes situation.
Yeah. Yep. It's an excellent framing, Helen. And this is something I really want to express quite confidently and clearly. I care a lot about this, which is that we need to be aware of the fact that we've got two systems in our brains. There's the rational system and the emotional system. There's been so many psychologists over the centuries that have commented on this. There's two that come to mind right away. Daniel Kahneman, Systems 1 versus Systems 2. I'm sure you're familiar, but I'll just summarize this by saying that Systems 1, I call it the amygdala response.
Right, yes.
It's when in this kind of high pressure situation, train journey being such a good classic textbook example of this, which is when you go into this very quick, unconscious, automatic, very emotional response to situations and stimuli versus Systems 2, which is more like the cerebellum aspect of your brain, motor coordination, logic, analysis, slow deliberation, making difficult decisions, problem solving, complex issues, that kind of thing. That's Systems 2, right? So we just need to all be aware that we're operating always in one of these two modes, and just take a step back and go, which mode am I operating in? Because that sets the context for everything else. And then the second psychologist comes to mind is Jonathan Haidt, or Haidt, H-A-I-D-T. So he had this fantastic analogy that he wrote about, which is the human rider and the elephant. Have you heard of it?
No.
Okay. Well, it's the parallel to Kahneman Systems 1, Systems 2. So the human rider is the rational Systems 2 element of it. So the human rider is trying to make a plan with an objective, problem solving. but the human rider is sitting on top of an elephant, and the elephant needs to get you to the objective, but the elephant is the emotion, is the systems one. And so if the elephant is in that fight or flight amygdala mode, doesn't matter. The human rider on top might still try to direct the elephant to get to a certain place, but you won't get there because the elephant is just all over the place, right? And that's an analogy that's quite powerful, but it just illustrates the relative weight of these two different systems.
Yes.
And how one is the foundation for the other. So the emotion needs to be stable enough in systems 2 land for you to even attempt to navigate the elephant.
Right.
And so with these high stakes environments, whether in Traitors or in real life, we are systems 1, or elephant is just going completely bonkers, right? So it's just then how do you work out a way to get to systems 2 in the first place? Because any attempt, and this was a particular moment, I remember at a round table later on in the season that comes to mind, where I think it was Alexander and Leanne having a bit of a discussion at the round table. Leanne was clearly in systems 1, feeling quite
Yes.
attacked. Alexander was just very cool, calm, collected, responding to her with logic. Systems 2, she was having none of it. And I just thought, what an amazing example of just what happens when you address systems 1 with systems 2, where the elephant is going like this and the rider is still trying to progress the elephant in a very futile manner. But that just comes to mind right away. And there's many examples, of course, that I have in my personal work life of the same situation.
Well, I'm thinking of loads.
Just like, don't even bother. If it's systems 1, you cannot rely upon logos, go back to Aristotle alone.
Right.
So the ethos and the pathos have to come out a lot more.
So how do we, because I'm thinking of this applies to any community. This applies to relationships, right? This applies to
absolutely
disagreements with a partner, family members, friends. Applies to the down to the wire in a work environment. You're in the Traitors scene set. What happens if you're stuck in systems 1? What happens if you have to get into systems 2, but because of your primitive responses and because you're feeling under threat, essentially, right? There's a perceived threat in the environment, which is why you're in systems 1.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Bingo.
So I guess that it's different strategies to be able to step out of that, right?
I think there's many frameworks that come to mind. The one that I think is most relevant, and I would like to make sure it's definitely mentioned in this chat, Helen, is Marshall Rosenberg, his principles of non-violent communication.
Yes.
And there's another animal analogy that comes to mind here. By the way, analogies is one of the most powerful rhetorical methods you can use, which also has impact in this particular systems 1 amygdala situation. But going back to Rosenberg first, it was the jackal versus the giraffe, right? So the easiest way, no, not easy, but the simplest or the most ideal way to transition out of systems 1 into systems 2 is to embody and employ giraffe rhetoric or giraffe style communication versus jackal. What I mean by that is a giraffe doesn't make judgments. A giraffe focuses on how am I feeling and what do I need? So what's the trigger for how I'm feeling? What in my environment is stimulating me to feel like I'm in systems 1, and what do I actually need? Because usually you feel something negative from an unmet need. And then you need to request that this stimulus changes, right? But the key thing is you're focusing on yourself as opposed to judging. So going back to the example of the round table with Leanne and Alexander, I think had Alexander focused in his response to Leanne less on the logic of the behavior that she had exhibited that led him to suspect her, but more on his emotion and how because that's irrefutable. She can't say that that's factually incorrect. How Alexander is feeling, or how Yin is feeling when she's trying to persuade, her colleagues to get out systems 1. How do you say? You have to accept that. And it's vulnerable as well, because instead of judging someone else and saying, you're being rude, you're being patronizing, you're being X, it's when this happens, I feel, this way. I feel uncomfortable because I need to have trust in you, or the unmet need has to be also, and it's very vulnerable to admit that. It goes back to that vulnerability point. But once you focus on yourself and start to use this non-judgmental rhetoric, this giraffe language, it does help. It's very difficult to do though, but to me, that is the way, that is the, not guaranteed, but it is the easiest way to get out of this systems one high pressure environment. Difficult to implement, but
No,
when it
but
comes to practice,
it is, because
right?
we're always going to be in these moments, and in the moment when we're completely in systems one, we're not going to have soft power. That can't exist, because we're not operating from the place in order to be able to reduce that distortion.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
what we have to do, and this this could be happening so many times in a day, I'm thinking in particular at the moment, having some troubles with my son and school, and so
Right.
there's a lot of systems one going on. Each day it's a navigation, it's a navigation of communication to persuade, but
Yes.
it's high stakes.
Lovely metaphor, the navigation. It's like you're constantly trying, it's a journey.
Yes.
And I think that's the way to frame any sort of communication situation.
Yes, and so we've got to. It's got to be a consistent, continuous check-in, a giraffe thinking check-in of how am I feeling in this moment? What do I need in order to move through this high-stakes emotional feeling to be able to move into systems two?
Yes.
Because it's system two that is where the slower thinking, the problem solving ability, the even creativity will drop in for me to be able to see things differently, and also therefore communicate in a way that I want it to land, and I want to persuade, I want to win that person over, whatever it might be.
I'll add a couple of things to this, if I may. I think words are important here as well, right? So the dimension I want to focus on is pronouns. The jackal style rhetoric is all about you. You're blaming someone. You're castigating that person. In this case, Helen, it would be, hey, why is your room so messy? To your son, you're lazy. You're this. You've got to stop that. Because if you keep going that way, the systems one gets worse and worse and worse. There will be explosion. You'll have bits of blood and guts and brain all over the walls, metaphorically speaking. And then it's me. It's the pronoun has to go to within, and that's hard to do because in that situation you want to attack the other person, right? So how do you then go to yourself and express vulnerability about how you feel, what you need? That's tricky, but it's the I language. So the pronouns you use so powerful. All communication contexts. One dimension that I really care about is the pronoun usage.
Yeah, right.
And so I just want to be tangible in that way. A couple of other things, if I may, and I just demonstrated one of these just now with my description of brain and guts and blood all over the place. If you use colorful language, metaphor, that also helps.
Yes.
You just laughed.
Yeah.
So laughter is the biggest KPI, key performance indicator, sorry to use a bit of business framing, but I view KPI for communication to be largely around the kind of subconscious emotional reactions like laughing, smiling. You can't prevent yourself from doing these things if you genuinely connect with someone. So going back to your first question, one of the earlier questions you had, how do you know that it's successful? That it's a feeling. Well, beyond the feeling, sometimes people you're laughing together, you're smiling, and you can't prevent that from happening. You can't lie about that. And so if you're using playful language and metaphors, right, in how you communicate in this high stakes environment, that will help tremendously. What I just said, that hyperbolic statement with the guts and the heart and everything, it's a bit of an analogy, it's a bit of hyperbole as well. You're being playful. It just takes you out of that literal stressful high pressure situation, makes you think about something a bit silly, and then by definition you'll smile a bit, even if you're annoyed. Hopefully you'll smile a bit, and then you'll relax a bit, and then that will hopefully lead you out. And I'd like to also add that, and this is what I couldn't do, I wasn't there for long enough, but I would have sung at the round tables. That was the plan. So there's a particular song that I've done also that I think, well, it was in my Uncloaked episode, and it kind of went out and spread across the internet, but it's the, am I faithful or am I traitor? The signs are subtle, I'm so unsure. And I'm on my board, forced to write the answer with a spelling mistake deliberately to be whimsical and playful, right? Am I faithful or am I traitor? Now, that might not have been the best timing, depending on the round table and the tone, but imagine if someone just bursts into song in a situation like that. Like singing disarms and delights in equal measure. It's disarming and delightful. Literally, it's a weapon that you can use, right?
Yeah. And it's
I'm not saying that in
disrupting.
the boardroom you should begin to sing and make it a musical, or indeed in a town hall meeting. I'm not saying that, Helen. What I'm saying, though, is that if it works to sing, to dance, do something a bit wacky, oh my God, you'll get armies of people to laugh and support you and connect with you. And we need more playfulness, goddammit, in our
That's what I was
language.
going to say. That's what I was going to say. The
Right.
term is
Yes.
that's the strategy. If you want to think about it as like a strategy, is playfulness.
Yes.
Playfulness
Language
in
is our
the
playground,
language.
Helen.
The language that
That's
we
it.
use it, and in I'm as a speaker coach, I coach people to develop keynote talks and TED talks, and
Mm.
it's all about the story. It's all about the analogy, the metaphor, the way that we're helping people to grasp something, to connect with something visually. Because when you said guts, and I literally, it was on the walls. I'm highly visual, and that's why
We
it
all
means
are. Yeah.
yeah. And with my son, so the other day, it was really really tricky conversation, and I started to tell him a story. And it was a completely random story because he was very upset. He was very into systems one, and I started telling him this story, and it was a bit of an odd story, but I could see
That's good. Honestly, the more wacky and eccentric and crazy and unexpected and almost illogical, the better, the more effective.
and it
Right?
worked. It
And
worked
it
because I could
worked. Oh,
see him coming
brilliant.
down. Then we started laughing. Then we
Laughter.
started,
There we go.
and then the state was changed. Yeah.
And you feel it, Helen. As I
Yeah.
said, it's a feeling. That information emotion flow has worked out. Distortion, very minimal, right? And you just feel with the other person. You're collectively laughing and smiling. And then you can progress with systems too. Excellent.
Yes.
What an amazing case study.
Yes. Well, I mean, I'm living this right now daily. So it really does apply. And also, let's think about another environment where this happens a lot, and the leaders I coach happens a lot is in those meetings, those high pressure meeting situations where you may be put on the spot. You may feel there's blame because there's accountability. You've been put in a position.
Sure.
Systems one, straight in there. And what's helped me in those situations in the past, and something that I coach the leaders on, and also something that we have discussed, is moving into listening and
Thank you for mentioning
exploring.
that.
So if you're feeling in your, the heart rate's up, the emotions are flying, I'm not sure how to respond to this, asking a question and listening can really help to move you through, right?
%. So that was deliberately random and whimsical because I want to make you laugh, which kind of happened. Right. So yes, and I say this because with such passion, because communication is actually more about listening than about speaking. And this is again part of the problem. When we think communication, we think the semantic field of that word is public speeches, presentations, social media posts. Like it's the explicit messages that we create and transmit to audiences, but not active listening. It's not just listening, it's active listening. It's a huge difference there. We don't teach children or adults how to actively listen. I was lucky, I was very fortunate that in my time in Oxford when I was doing the PhD, I did happen to join an informal an organization which is the peer support program. And so the point of this was to teach students how to actively listen so that they could better support their peers. And we were trained to be peer supporters, and it's all across the different colleges. Informal though, because it wasn't enforced. We didn't have to have a certain number of people, but I voluntarily said, I want to spend three hours per week in this training. Absolutely. Training to be an active listener. And it was very difficult. In fact, I think one of the most difficult courses I've ever taken, because the instinct is to give advice. This is not active listening. This is, you're still the main character. The person who's talking to you, their words are kind of landing, but you're inclined to go, if I were in your shoes, I would do X. No, 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 no. That's not active listening. You're still there. Active listening is you set yourself aside and you just absorb what they're saying, and often sometimes not even responding or just nodding, acknowledging what they're saying, but not responding. That's more powerful than going, I would recommend you do this. Right. So that we don't teach that. We teach the opposite. We teach giving advice. We teach people how to produce. And this is all part of the problem, that a lot of what we're doing now is giving people the tools to magnify the messages that they can produce. We're drowning in oceans of communication, way more than our predecessors, right? And so because we're just so exposed to this, there's no time really, or there is time, but we don't realize that we should be teaching listening as well. But this is the key takeaway, that listening is the most important aspect of communication.
Well, it is.
Which sounds such like a very odd thing to say, but I believe that this is the area that I myself want to improve on. I think I'm quite weak in listening ability, but I'm acutely aware of it. And this is the way that I will be able to reduce the arc of distortion between myself and my listeners, and hopefully then improve the quality of my communication, right? But I think this is the biggest impact I can make. Whimsy and playfulness, sure. I think those are very important, but if you haven't listened properly, doesn't matter what techniques you use in how you project yourself and message, you've got to really understand how the other person is feeling and what their needs are first. So thank you for mentioning that, Helen.
Yeah, and I really wholeheartedly. It's always I've been a coach for many years. I trained as a coach from the age of 18, but being an active listener is a journey as well, because of what's always trying to hijack that. But really, at the root of this human connection is that we all just want to be heard. And so if we can provide a space for really hearing the other person, then the it's going to be a much better foundation for successful communication to occur.
Yes, and often even just giving someone the safe space to articulate what's on their mind when they're in a systems one state, that in and of itself might help transition them out of systems one, at which point cracking a joke, telling a whimsical story would be very powerful. So you listen, and then you employ that playful, eccentric rhetoric, as it were. Possibly, there's no formula to this, right?
No.
But that is one method through which I myself have successfully gotten out of the high stakes, high pressure situations.
Yeah, it depends on the situation. It depends on I call it the stakeholder. It depends on the person, you're communicating to, the group of people that you're communicating to, and what strategy is going to work best. And sometimes they layer. I teach like push-pull influencing, and, sometimes we need to go in with a pull, as in we need to sit back, hold space, ask a question, find out information, make that person people feel heard. And then we might need to go in with a push.
Yes. True.
To back up with reasons as to why this might be a good idea, and then we may need to find some common ground to build trust. So that's where the playfulness and the sort of connection,
ethos as well. Ethos, building trust, credibility. That's the foundation of ethos, right? So yes, exactly. The push-pull analogy is excellent, Helen. I like that.
I use that as I can't remember the name of the model. It's quite a detailed model, and it's all around sort of energetic push pull, and there's many strategies under push, many strategies under pull. That's the main sort of framework of the courses that I teach around influence. Yeah.
Okay.
I can share that with you afterwards.
Please do.
So I want to just finish on something that we spoke about. Well, storytelling is something that I absolutely love, and I teach my clients to really embody their natural intrinsic skill of storytelling, because we all have it within us. It's it's ingrained. It's something we just tap into. But in the environment of the traitors, where, as we've said, there's no such thing as a lie, it's just a good story. Traitors, the environment of the traitors wasn't about lying because it was fictitious. I wanted to just end on this discussion we had around the levels of the relationship between storytelling, visibility, and control.
Okay, excellent point to end on. And this has such parallels with non-traitor scenarios as well. Think about, so one of the frameworks methods for communication science is storytelling. And there's so much you can look into about different narratives and formats. But the main point is, as we saw in Traitors, it's whoever tells the best story, whether faithful or traitor, will have a huge chance of staying longer and eventually winning. It is, in my view, it's about persuasive communication, aka rhetoric, and equally about storytelling. And I've been telling stories since I could, I think, speak. I've always wanted to write things down and create characters. And I view myself as a character. And in fact, I frame the whole experience of Traitors as two parallel tracks, action and fiction. There's the meta commentary behind the scenes, yellow sofa room. There's the actual fiction of the castle and the missions, and they're dovetailing in parallel, right? But going to the levels of storytelling power, though, there's three levels at least that I can pick out from Traitors that again have parallels in real life. You begin with the faithful level. And part of the reason I wanted to be a traitor was because this level is the least potent, as it were.
Yeah.
So to use an analogy, the stories that faithfuls tell is equivalent to cooking with just like salt and pepper and eggs and bread and milk, some flour. You can make a pancake just about, not
Basic
sweeter.
ingredients.
But you're limited in the flavor of what you can produce. And it's the most visible because guess what? You've got to articulate these stories at the breakfast room, random bits in the castle, and of course at the round table to be able to survive. All the cards are laid out transparently, and the characters are quite clear. I think this person is traitor because right? That's quite clear. That's faithful level. Now, going up a level, this is why I really wanted to be a traitor, you have so much more storytelling power. So you add in the garam masala, the cumin, the coriander, the Cajun seasoning at this level, right? You got more flavor and less visibility, which goes hand in hand with more flavor. So you tell stories through who you murder. And if there's a particular unique scenario, like in this season, we had the death match. In previous ones, we had people on trial. Same principle. Who do you put in that death match? Who is on trial? That's the story, the narrative. But because no one else is in the turret, apart from the traitors and Claudia, no one knows what the actual hidden elements of the plot are. You're kind of revealing the story through this person was murdered, but then the motivations for the murder are left up to people to guess. So there's less visibility of the elements of the story, and it's more powerful because of that. And then as a traitor, of course, you spin a narrative. Oh, Lynn was murdered clearly because these people thought she was a threat, that kind of thing. So it's you can manipulate a lot more and control a lot more. And then ultimately, the most powerful level of storytelling is from the producers. What missions do you put in the first place? The seer, having that role as a net new, that was a complete game changer for our season, defined the season in my view.
Yeah.
Hello, that was all from the storytelling of the producers, which was the least visible, but the most powerful. So they've got not just the spices and things, they've got exotic vegetables and fruits being flown in from all over the world. They have a whole arsenal. I love cooking. I always use it as my analogy. But you can imagine that they're cooking with Gordon Ramsay level or MasterChef level equipment, different pots and pans alongside the exotic vegetables and meats, alongside the spice. I'll stop there. And then there's Claudia as well. I'm not sure if she's a fourth level per se, but she certainly is the ultimate narrator. She's visible when she has to be, but largely invisible.
Yes.
And she's part of production, but also not.
Yes.
But think about her as well, and in parallels outside Traitors, who is the equivalent to a Claudia in an organizational context.
Yes, this is why when you spoke about this and I read it again in your interview, this you can apply this in so many different ways.
I mean, be aware of what level of storytelling what do you have as power in your organization, your context, even in a personal relationship, right? Be aware of what level of power you have and what level the other people have as well. Yeah. That's the key thing from this, and make the most of it.
Wonderful. Love. Ian, I could talk to you all day.
Likewise.
I absolutely love this conversation. You and I, we love this. We love the same things, and to do with communication and words.
Yes.
It's just something that really excites me. As you said in one of your talks, it is the wine, the gin. Even though I don't drink anymore, but it's that feeling of the relationship with this that's very exciting. And so it's been an absolute honor to speak to you on the podcast today. And as with all my guests, I end with one final question, and that is, what words have changed your life?
Ooh, okay. Before I get to that, I want to say one thing, one bit of feedback, which is I believe, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the arc of distortion between us has been very low.
Yes.
I'm talking to a kindred spirit here, someone who really gets it, and the information and emotion flow. We're not even in the same room. If we were, it'd be even more of an energy bouncing off the walls kind of thing. So thank you for allowing me to indulge in just like my greatest passions in life. I mean, it's all coming together in this conversation. I'll end with a pretty simple quote that I think is really profound and relates so well to all that we've discussed, or the contours of our conversation, which is that we see things not as they are, but as we are. And that's from Anais Nin. And it really emphasizes the fact that we can't assume that other people share our brains, right? This is the whole thing. Like, we are kind of each to our own. We're all unique individuals. And because we see things as we are, not as they are, you cannot assume that just by saying something, the other person you're speaking to would get it and completely be aligned with you, right? We're all biased by ourselves and our experiences. And so if we recognize that we see things as we are with that massive kind of self-bias, it unlocks the potential for us to become a communication scientist in the first place, which is all about, right, I need to work to understand my audience and then to pivot and iterate my strategies to align with them and use the right metaphors and use the right songs and music if I can weave that in, kind of thing. Does that make sense? So
it does.
That I need to end on that because it's so foundational to understanding why communication science is needed in the first place.
Yeah, I'm completely bought in, sold, signed up on 100%. And I love how we've just weaved that right background to that simple idea of, continuously working to reduce that distortion between intention and impact. And that quote there just beautifully sums that up. Thank you so much, Yin.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.